Okay, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Can I welcome you to tonight's event, the launch of the 10th Audit of Political Engagement by the Hansard Society. Tonight is not quite going to go as planned. Democracy in action tonight. You'll all, I'm sure, be aware, shocked, I'm sure, that our members of Parliament here to my right are going to have to go and vote this evening on some pretty important votes on the Queen's speech and the referendum issue. So we're going to have to play it by ear. There are 4 votes from 7 o'clock, so they're going to have to go. They may be able to come back, they may not. We'll have to see how the timing goes in terms of that. So the plan is that my colleague Matt Corris is going to start the initial part of the presentation. Then we're going to ask Chloe Smith, the Minister at the Cabinet Office, to give her response. Depending upon the time at that point, Chloe will depart for the vote. I think Natascha has got to head off slightly before that for the vote. As and when Natascha gets back, she'll give her response. Matt will do the second half of the presentation, and then we'll go to Peter. That's the plan, I hope. We will play it by ear as we go. So my apologies if it's a little more disjointed than it would normally have been. So I'm not going to waste time on introductions. We're just going to go straight into it. Many of you will be familiar with this event. So can I ask a welcome for my colleague Matt Corris, who's going to give the opening presentation of the findings from this year's audit report. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ruth. I'm going to try and get some of the headline figures done in this first part of the presentation, and I will move on to some other bits and pieces in the second part. For those of you who don't know, the Audit of Political Engagement, now in its 10th year, is an annual opinion poll study that we do at the Hansard Society, tracking the public's engagement with politics, their interests, their knowledge, their satisfaction with our system of governing, our MPs, and many other things besides, which you will see in due course. For those of you who have been following the audit for some years, you'll probably know that the findings, the levels of engagement have been pretty stable for most of the last decade, up until last year. Last year we saw a noticeable decline in people's interest in politics, their knowledge of politics, their certainty to vote, and we were wondering whether this was a blip. Was this one bad year when we caught people at the wrong moment and they were they felt much worse about politics, or is this the start of an ongoing decline? So our first question was, is this a one-year blip? And the answer is no, not really, because the levels of interest in politics, 42% of the public say they're interested in politics, is exactly unchanged from last year. 42% of the public feel they know at least a fair amount about politics. The change of -2% is statistically insignificant, and likewise, around satisfaction with the system of governing, a meaningless slight rise, and no change in people's feeling of efficacy with the political system. So last year's decline in many of our key indicators of engagement sadly was not a blip. The good news is it hasn't gone down any further, but that's not terribly encouraging. However, there has been one noticeable continual decline this year, and that is in people's propensity to vote. You can see from the chart that the likelihood of people voting, when they're asked on a scale of 1 to 10, how likely are you to vote, that has declined again this year. Just 41% of the public now say that they are certain to vote in the event of an immediate general election. To put this in perspective, that was 48% last year, but in every other year of the audit in the last decade, that number has been over 50%. So there's a worrying and continuing decline in people's likelihood to vote. And the question asks about an immediate general election. We've seen some rather poor turnouts at the local elections, and also particularly for the Police and Crime Commissioner elections in November last year. But even at a general election, these figures are not particularly rosy. 20% of people, 1 in 5, now say they are certain not to vote. This is double the figure who said the same 2 years ago. So again, a real worry in terms of how likely people are to vote. Moving on to voting in young people, it was 30% of young people said they were certain to vote 2 years ago. Last year this had gone down to 22%, and this year, sadly, we are right down at 12%. of 18 to 24-year-olds say they are certain to vote at a general election, which raises two questions. One is, if we're talking at any point about lowering the voting age to 16, certainly the 18 to 24-year-olds aren't keen on voting. Would lowering the voting age to 16 really help? And the second is, there's a belief that getting people into the habit of voting at an early age will help make them continue voting throughout the rest of their lifetimes. If 18 to 24-year-olds aren't going to vote now, does this mean that fewer are going to vote in elections in the decades to come? On to knowledge of politics and the complexity of politics that people find. This is a quote from one of our focus groups last year about people saying it's all too confusing and choosing to ignore it. As I said, 42% of the public feel they know at least a fair amount about politics. 55% of them say that politics is complicated and hard to understand for someone like me. And we decided we would test this with a series of true or false quiz questions to try and understand how much the public do know about politics. So, true or false quiz question, the minimum age for voting is 16. Well, obviously false, that one. 71% of people get the right answer to that. 29% either get it wrong or don't know that the minimum age for voting is not 16. This, I would say, there is no evidence that the discussions in Scotland about lowering the voting age for the referendum has had any impact on this, at least certainly not in Scotland. The proportion of people in the Scottish part of the sample getting this right is just the same as anywhere else in the country. So I can't attribute anything around that to changing this result. Moving on, members of the House of Lords are elected by the British public. I can see at least two members of the Lords sitting in here with me. We had an entire year's worth or more discussion about reform of the House of Lords last year. 67%, two-thirds, know that members of the House of Lords are not elected. So one-third of the British public, despite all of the discussions about House of Lords reform last year, still don't know the answer to this. One of our favourite ongoing ones, government and parliament are the same thing, which they are not. 60% get that right, 40%, 2 in 5 get it wrong. You are automatically registered to vote if you pay council tax. Given the system of registering to vote is changing, this is another one we think is really rather important. 45% of people, again, do not get this right. That's nearly half of the public do not know that if you are paying council tax, that does not automatically make you registered to vote. Political parties receive some state funding, another ongoing debate around political reform. Again, half the public, no idea that political parties do get some state funding. And finally, the issue, especially for today, British members of the European Parliament are directly elected by British voters. You would really like to think, with all of the discussions we're having about Europe, that people might have some idea about this one. Sadly not. More than half of the public do not think that we directly elect our MEPs. So is there any surprise that there is quite so much discontent about Europe if people have such limited knowledge about it? Moving on to Parliament and MPs, and one more effectively knowledge quiz question. What proportion of the public can name their own MP? Well, this for many years had been fairly static at just under half of the public could name their MP. A couple of years ago we were down at 38% of the public could name their MP, and this year only about 1 in 5 of us can name our MP. Now the 38% was after the general election, so you would expect turnover of MPs, fewer people might know who their member is. I mean, there was a big turnover, but the fact that it has declined another 16 points in the last 2 years, somewhat baffling, but rather concerning as well. What do the public think about MPs? Well, there has been a decline again in satisfaction. This is the lowest level of satisfaction with MPs in general in the entire audit series. This is lower than after the expenses scandal, where we didn't see all that much of a change. But the rise has not been in dissatisfaction. It's not that people are more dissatisfied, it's that more of them do not take a view. They say they're neither satisfied nor dissatisfied, or they just don't know. So it's not awful, but it's still not good. We asked the same question about whether you're satisfied with your own MP. And as in previous years, people are more satisfied with their MP than they are with MPs in general. This is despite the fact they can't name their MP, but they're still more satisfied with them. The changes here are probably statistically insignificant, but at least the trend is about the same. So I'd sum this up with satisfaction down, ambivalence, lack of interest definitely up. In terms of Parliament, there's been no change in the level of satisfaction with Parliament. 27% of us say we're satisfied with Parliament. Parliament is usually seen as the collection of MPs rather than the broader institution. But there are two bits of good news here. In terms of people's perceptions, the proportion of the public who think that Parliament holds government to account has gone up, which is a good thing, as has the proportion who think that Parliament debates and makes decisions about issues that matter to me. And these are up on the last year and are hopefully statistically significant changes. And so what might be the reasons for this? Well, the increasing prominence of select committees tackling issues that have been big news stories, phone hacking, the tax for multinational companies, issues like that, urgent questions in the House of Commons, making the House of Commons a place where topical issues are debated, the issues of the day, and backbench business debates. Natascha chairs the Backbench Business Committee that's allowing backbench members to bring topical issues to the floor of the House of Commons more often. All of these things much more topical and potentially the reasons why the public have slightly better perceptions of how Parliament works at the moment. And at this point, I'm going to stop. It's the end of part one.
Okay, thank you, Matt. So Natascha has had to go and vote and sit in on the initial final stages of the debate before the vote. So I'm going to ask Chloe to speak next. Those people who stood at that stood up by the doors, there are 3 seats in each of the window ledgers. If you want to grab one of those seats now, just while before Chloe kicks off. Where do you want to speak? Yeah, the microphones are working. That's fine.
Right, with the Chair's permission in that case, off I'll go. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for making the time to come in. I think it's actually a testament to the work of the audit that actually this is a standing room only event, which, despite some of the decline we're seeing, I think is I hope is a good sign, at least in one small room. Some of you might well think that I have possibly one of the worst jobs in this building tonight, in being the member of the government, the member of Parliament, the member of the establishment that has to reflect on these figures. And yes, I worry about some of these figures just as much as any of you will do. But I think actually the real message I take from this is a message about individuals. Yes, we've seen aggregated data that, of course, is statistically scaled and accurate and really great to have from a data point of view. But underneath each one of those, of course, is one of the teenagers who is sitting with their head in their hands in that photograph, or is any one of us in this room who might have responded to such a survey. And I take that responsibility, actually, of dealing with individuals quite seriously, because I do think it is the place where we can do something to try to shift those figures back again. And I'll pick up 3 points within that. One is about something the government is doing. Matt, you referred to this in the first place. It's moving the way we register people to vote. And that is moving to a system I'm going to assume probably if you've come here to this event tonight, you might be a little familiar with it. We're moving to a system of individual electoral registration. And for me, the I in that is immensely important. The I in that says that people are going to have to take up their own duty to register themselves. You won't get it just because you pay council tax. You won't get it because in the past the head of your household may have filled that form out for you. Personally, I view that shift as actually one of the last bricks in the wall of very important equality and liberation questions of having the right to fill out your own registration form. I think it's actually rather important. But I do think within that is something very positive, in fact, that the government is doing that does go right to the heart of some of these questions here. And if we can get it right, and I would like to call on all you to help government and to help your local authorities and to help people you know get out and get registered, then I do think we have a rather interesting thing to go from there. The second point of individuality I have to pick up is actually what I, as an individual MP, can do, and again, any of you who are individually politically involved can do about those figures. Constituency MPs, I think, in this country do take that very, very seriously, and I would make the point that you could compare that to a system of proportional representation, typically, where there is less duty to be in a particular place and work for particular people. Of course, in Britain, we take that immensely seriously. I could tell you all about my constituency diary for Saturday, and you'll know just how many hours the average MP puts into that. And I do think, again, that is an important tool that we all have to look at in order to tackle some of these figures. I and all my colleagues will want to make our way around as many individuals as we possibly can in the areas that we represent in order to talk to them, in order to hear their views, and in order to shift some of those figures. That is immensely important, and I do think it's a duty both on us as individual politicians, and I do include in that members of the audience who are also politically involved, but also then the duty on us is to meet those people as individuals. The third point I would make about individuals actually is to go right to an element of the data we've just seen, or that we may get out in further debate a bit later. And that's the section about political engagement. If you've had a chance to have a look at some of those figures, there are some really, actually, quite positive figures about what people think they would like to do in their constituency on the brain, in their community, what people would like to be able to do in response to a local issue, how much people think they would stand up and do something if something was important to them. I do think it suggests when you take that in conjunction with some of the generational data that is in this report, that we have to confront all of these very, I think now increasingly obvious questions of a change in the way people want to look at issues. It's now a truism to talk about single issue politics, but I do suspect we are seeing some of this come through in these figures. My hope would be that if we can use the positive figures in here about people wanting to get engaged and get involved and do something and be a person like me in politics, that is in this report, then I think we should do absolutely everything possible to encourage that. I say we, again, we are but individuals. We can go and talk to our individual friends, our individual members of our family, individual students at schools. We can all play a bit of a part, again, in helping the individuals who are represented in these data come forward and do what they want to do. And I do think that is the future duty of not only government, not only Parliament, but also a certain civil society point you might make out of that. So for me, that's just some three particular reflections on the theme of the individuals that are here behind this data, and on reflections on what we can do about it. It would, I think, be somewhat dull if I sat up here and gave you instead a whole litany of every government policy that could possibly relate to this area, because these data are so wide, and that's what's exciting about them. I don't think that would quite engage you tonight before the rest of the event. But I do think the individual electoral registration is one important policy to have noted. I'd be particularly keen to work with the Hansard Society actually in making sure that we can spread that message very much far and wide. And I would particularly urge everyone in this room to do as I'm doing and reflect on what you too can do about this data.
Great. Thank you very much, Chloe. Okay. I think what we're going to do then is my colleague Matt is probably going to do part two, kick off part two, and see where we get to. I should have mentioned that we are twittering. Our hashtag is #audit9. So if you want to join in the discussion, Audit 10, Audit 10. Thank you, Audit 10. So please do join in the discussion online. We're going to be really radical and suggest that you can perch down here. There are 2 chairs And there's also sort of a ledge down here, so if anybody wants to come and sit in the well, please do. It's going to be a long hour. It's quite warm in here. So please, you're going to have to...
Some brave people.
Two can sit here while we go and vote. So sit in the Minister's chair and the Rebels' chair.
Thank you very much for having me. Please forgive me while I go and do my bit of business.
Cheers. Right, Matt, over to you. Part 2.
Right then. Okay, so heading backwards a bit to some of the knowledge issues I was picking up earlier on that I wanted to talk about a bit further. We asked people whether they wished they'd learnt more about politics at school, having seen how little they actually knew about politics. And the encouraging thing is that half the public do say that they wish they'd learned more about politics in school. The next question was, what do you wish you had learned about? And the interesting thing here is the main 3 things that people wanted to have learned more about are quite sort of procedural, institutional, factual things, rather than the last of these ones, how better to have my own personal say in politics. It was more how the system works, sort of quite basic functional questions. So there clearly is a very important issue around people's political engagement. This is something the Hansard Society does a lot about with our citizenship engagement programme, trying to help politics teachers and citizenship teachers teach politics more effectively. But there is clearly a lot more to do to try and inform people at a young age successfully about politics, how the political system works. Getting on to involvement, as Chloe touched on. We've changed the way we've asked questions about people's political activity this year. We've asked a slightly refined set of questions so that we can see what actions people said they have done in the last 12 months and what they would do. So we asked people, have you voted in the last 12 months, and would you vote if you felt strongly enough about an issue? You can see that 27% say they voted in the last year. This is a bit of an unfair question because not everybody around the country had an election last year, but obviously we know what the turnouts were in local elections. The worrying thing is, even when the question is phrased, would you vote if an issue was important to you, still only 42% of the public say they would, which is just the same as the 41% who said they were certain to vote. So not a particularly encouraging figure here. The next most common activity to have done in the last year was to donate money to a charity or campaign group, and a similar proportion say they would consider doing in the future. And then you get on to petitions, and I hope Natascha can come back to this later. The next 2 most commonly undertaken activities were sign a petition, either an electronic petition or a paper one. But I think the interesting thing here is that more of the public say they would sign a paper petition if they felt strongly about an issue than an e-petition. So I think we need to make sure that while e-petitions are the things that are being sort of getting the most coverage in the press and the e-petition system connecting into Parliament, paper petitions still have strong resonance for a larger proportion of the public than e-petitions. And finally, the last thing on this list, there's many more activities, but on this particular slide, contacting your local council or MP. This is the second highest activity on the would-do list. So just after voting, it's the next most common thing people would do is contact a local politician. And I think we saw that, for those of you who were here last year, in another set of questions, we asked if you had a problem with your local health service, who would you go to make to take it up? And after your local GP, the next person on the list was your local MP. Above council, Citizens Advice Bureau, media, and many other things, the local MP was the next most common sort of point of call for help. These were the full list of activities we asked people about, whether they'd done any of these and whether they would do any in the future. Half of the public had done at least one of these activities in the last year, and 78% said they would be willing to do at least one of them in the future. So this is vote number 1. 1 of 4. So there's some slight encouragement in the sense that people might do some of these activities and at least one of these activities in the future. But none of the activities have a particularly high rating. I mean, voting, as I showed you on the last slide, was the most commonly answered activity, followed by contacting an MP. And we asked people to what extent they want to be involved. Do they desire being involved? And the answer is yes, and this is another encouraging finding. Do you want to be involved in local decision making? It's up 9 points from last year. This has bounced back from quite disappointing result the previous year. And 42% say they would like to be involved in national decision making, which is good, but if you're not going to vote, and fewer people say they're certain to vote, I'm not sure how people feel that they are going to express their interest in getting involved if voting, which is the simplest and most straightforward of the activities for getting involved, isn't on people's radar. We also asked about whether a person like me could do a good job as a local councillor. This young man is a 21-year-old who got elected in North Yorkshire for the Conservative Party the recent elections, jumping for joy. About a quarter of us say that a person like me could do a good job as a local councillor. We also asked, we've got Jack Straw on a soapbox, whether a person like me could do a good job as an MP. Slightly smaller, about 1 in 5 of us say that a person like me could do a good job as an MP. Now, one wonders what the reasons behind this are. Do people understand that MPs have pretty hard jobs? It's not your 9 to 5, it's demanding, it's stressful, and they think, oh, I couldn't do that. Do they not identify with MPs? They think MPs are somehow very different to them and they couldn't imagine someone like them being an MP? Or does that lack of knowledge we touched on earlier mean they think, I couldn't do that, I wouldn't understand any of this? One way or another, neither of these figures suggests that people feel that someone like them is likely to stand and get involved in politics, which is rather disappointing. In terms of people potentially getting involved, we've done some segmentation of the data, which I will explain. We divided the public up on the following basis. We have manifest people, the people who do get involved already, who have done a political activity in the last 12 months, who are likely to vote. They're quite easy to identify. We have the non-participants on the other side of that pie chart, the people who aren't going to vote, haven't done any activities, are really disengaged by almost all of the other measures we ask in the audit. 19% of people don't fit into this model, so I'm going to ignore them, at least for the moment. But I'm interested in the standby people. We've called them standby citizens or potential participants. These people haven't done any of the political activities we ask about, but they are interested, feel at least a bit knowledgeable, are fairly likely to vote. And the interesting thing we get is that the attitudes of the people in the standby group and in the manifest group are very similar. If you look at all of the other questions asked in the audit, similar levels of interest in politics, of knowledge, of belief in the efficacy of getting involved. So these groups are actually quite similar, and the only differentiating factor is the people in the manifest group actually have done some activity. So it's the potential, we would like to think, that these people aren't that far off getting involved themselves. If we found the right issues to engage them, it might be possible to get these people active in politics, but quite how to do that is not something I can give you an easy answer to in a survey. Another segment of the population I'd like to look at is we ask people how interested you are in politics, and that's 42% of the public say they're interested in politics, but a greater proportion of the public are interested in news and current affairs. Now, unsurprisingly, almost everyone who's interested in politics is also interested in news and current affairs. However, of the people who are interested in news and current affairs, only half of those are interested in politics. The other half aren't, so they're not very or not at all interested in politics, and that makes up 1/3 of the British public. So a third of the British public are interested in news and current affairs, but not politics. Now, for those of us in this room, we know that almost everything in the news, almost all of our current affairs, is political, is related to politics in some way. So this is about how people see politics, and they probably think of it in terms of party politics. So these people may be anti-party politics, but they're certainly consuming the same kind of news and information about political issues. So there's the potential, one would like to think, that if we could encourage them to take the wider view that politics is all of these issues that they do spend their time, consuming information about, we might be able to get them a bit more engaged. Who are these people? So these 33% of the public who don't particularly like party politics but are interested in news. Well, in terms of the population as a whole, there are more women than men in this group. And there are more of the, not the highest social class, the AB social class, but all of the other social classes are pretty well represented amongst this group. And these are the people with slightly lower levels of political engagement generally, who one would like to think you would want to be targeting if you want to raise levels of political engagement. These people are more likely than average to read a tabloid newspaper and less likely to read a broadsheet. They're less likely to get any of those political knowledge questions right than average. They're less likely to know the name of their MP. They're less likely to have done any of the political activities, and they're less likely to say they would do any of them in the future. They're less likely to want to be involved in national decision making, and they have a lower opinion of Parliament and MPs. So there's still clearly quite a lot to do to overcome these barriers of engagement amongst them, but I still think there's a potential, if we could encourage them to take a broader view about what politics is, that these people could be more engaged. Finally, on to one last point. For those of you who were here last year, we asked the public at a series of focus groups, after an hour-and-a-half discussion, what do you think would improve British politics? And the answers we got back weren't anything that the politicians have spent any time discussing. It wasn't constitutional changes, it wasn't electoral reform or any of those things. It was making politics more transparent, making politicians more accountable for the promises they make and more accountable between elections. So we decided we ought to test those different suggestions in the audit survey to see if our focus groups were representative of the country as a whole. And encouragingly, they were. So at the top of the list, make politics more transparent, make politicians more accountable for their performance between elections. Midway down, give citizens more of a say, referendums. Right down at the bottom, constitutional changes, House of Lords, voting system. And actually even lower, more people like me as MPs. So that's not necessarily the public's priority, having more people like them as MPs. But as I showed earlier, people don't feel like someone like them could be an MP. The final point, and this is I think a point we made last year, is what does making politics more transparent and easier to follow mean to people? Because politics is, a lot of politics is very transparent. It's more transparent now than it ever has been in the future. And yet, political engagement is declining and certainty to vote is declining. Making politicians more accountable between elections, what does that mean to people? And what proposals could one bring forward that would work, that would satisfy these demands? I leave that to you, hopefully, to make suggestions and ask questions later, because that's an area that hopefully we are going to try and look at in our further research. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Matt. So I'm going to go straight to Natascha Engel, Labour MP, Chair of the Backbench Business Committee. We'll find out tomorrow morning from the Speaker whether she has been re-elected to that post, hot off the press tomorrow morning. So before she has to dash off for the second vote, Natascha, you can go there or up there, whichever you prefer. Yeah.
We're right in the middle of two votes, and the next vote is one that I really must go to, and which the whips would really like me not to go to. So when the bell rings, I'm going to sprint, and then I'll come straight back again. I just wanted to tell you two little stories. One of them, I think, is an indication of how we as MPs in this Parliament think that the expenses scandal is over and done with. We've had a new election, we've had a new intake of MPs, and everything is fine now, and it isn't. And another story about how politicians speak and kind of speak like politicians and not like normal people. And so when you were talking about questions about understanding, transparency and all that, that actually it's a lot about the kind of vocabulary that we use. The first story was this weekend when I went to see an old party member who's who's just had a heart attack. And I went to see him, and he was waiting for his son and his daughter-in-law to come and visit him. And they were taking their time, and so I kind of did a bit of washing up. And they were walking through the door, and I had my hands in the sink, and the woman said, so who are you? And I said, I'm Natascha. She said, oh, are you the MP? And I said, yes, hello. And she said, oh, nice to see an MP doing some work. and I thought, my God, that's extraordinary. The sort of attitude, sort of casual sort of dismissal of MPs just because of the jobs that they do. I mean, there was absolutely no sort of acceptance that I was there to see this man as a friend who'd just had a heart attack. So I think that's kind of an indication of how far away MPs have grown from people's affection, I think. And the second story was about HS2. In January, HS2, the plans for the route were unveiled. They were published. I hadn't heard anything about them, and they went through quite a large sort of swathe of the north of the constituency. I hadn't heard about it, but nor had any of the people whose houses the train was going through. And so I thought it'd be a really good idea to call a public meeting. And we had an extraordinary response. We had 3 public meetings in 2 towns and 1 village. These are places where I really struggle to get people to come to surgeries. I've knocked on people's doors and kind of said, why won't you come to, we're doing coffee mornings and surgeries and, all sorts of things. Why won't you come and see me? And they say, well, my problems aren't so big that I need to go and see an MP about them. So there's, there's that distance as well. But when we had an open meeting on HS2, suddenly this was something that really did matter to people, and we had hundreds of people turning up. And these were people who would never normally have come to any sort of public meeting. And I opened the meeting, and people were, these aren't your sort of mobile middle class where you sort of say, we're going to build a train through your house, and they say, how much are you going to give me, and move on. These are people who've lived in these villages for generations, and it's not that they lack the imagination, it's that these are their communities, these are their lives. And there were, grown men who were crying because it meant so much to them. And they did not want to move. It wasn't about compensation, this was about their lives. And they kept asking me, where do you stand? Where do you stand on this? Are you for it or are you against it? And I say, well, it's not really a matter of being for or against. I mean, in principle, I'm for high-speed trains. And I understand the sort of arguments about connectivity and about capacity and all that. And really, I think it's really important that we participate fully in the consultation exercise that's just about to take place. And I could see the entire audience just kind of, hearing politicians speak, and all they wanted to hear was I for it or was I against it? And it was that massive disconnect. And also I was wearing a suit, and I looked like I'd come from London with the very bad news that I was going to destroy their lives. And it didn't matter who I was a figure of authority. And it wasn't even about, we were so far away from having the discussion about whether I represented these people. I mean, this was just, we were miles away from that. And so we've ended up doing something completely different, which was actually kind of setting up much smaller groups and looking at what we can do to, get people themselves to engage in stopping HS2 if that's what they want to do. I mean, there wasn't a single person there who wanted HS2. We also had, in the hundreds of people in each of the meetings, we asked who had been to London in the last 5 years, and we had no more than sort of 3 or 4 hands went up. So I mean, again, these are not sort of mobile communities in any way. And it was really about that sense that it was about Westminster going out to rural England and telling it what was best for it without ever really kind of talking to it about what it really wanted, and never really having a chance to say, but hang on, this is my life that you're putting a train line through. And frankly, the national economic growth argument, it doesn't really work for me. This was their livelihood and their local jobs that we were driving a train through. So I think actually we need to really kind of go back a lot further than just looking at kind of, and I'm obviously an avid follower and reader of the Audit of Political Engagement 1 to 10, but actually I think I think it's much more basic, and all the stuff that you were talking about with young people as well. I talk to lots of young people, and they they don't really see the point. And I'm a big fan of votes at 16, but also understand that lowering the voting age will in itself not increase political engagement. What will increase political engagement is the day we start talking to people about things that matter to them and giving them an actual choice in what it is that we are presenting them with, and not all of us saying that, all of us are for HS2, therefore not giving you a choice. All of us are against having an EU referendum, although I know that's what takes today. But anyway, but the point is that when all the main political parties agree on something, that's when you rob people of any sort of choice. And I think those are the sort of very basic things that we really need to be looking at before we can start looking at proper political engagement. So I'm going to go and sit down now.
Thank you. And just to say, there will be copies of the report as you leave. So do make sure you pick up them. There'll be a couple of boxes there and a couple of boxes at this exit as well. Right, Peter, I think is going to tell us perhaps how basic it really is.
Right. How long do you want me to speak for? Right, I'm not going to speak for very long anyway.
5-8 minutes, however.
Super. I must say I have read this audit of a political engagement, and it really is completely a compelling piece of work. I mean, this statistic that the number of people who actually, come what may, won't vote has doubled from 10 to 20% in the last 2 years is just fantastically interesting. I'm rather dismayed that 25% of people take an interest in news and current affairs. There's always a sure worrying sign when people do that, and I thought the true figure, I'm sure, is much, much lower than that. I hope it is anyway. But what you get here is a picture which is of a collapsing political system. It's incredibly powerful, and particularly if you look at the trend over last 10 years, you have here a system of political parties and representative democracy which is clearly in collapse. And what's very interesting, just from a newspaper point of view, is that if you look at the readership of newspapers, exactly the same thing is happening. I mean, I think I'm right in saying that the readership of the Times, for instance, has gone down by 40% in the last 5 years. It's part, somehow, I think, of exactly the same trend. That there is something is happening and nobody is quite sure what it is. And the analogy also is that Ian Duncan Smith became leader of the Conservative Party in 2001. There were 300,000 Tory activists, Tory members. I doubt the figure is much more than 100,000 now, and so you have something incredibly dramatic has happened. The party system doesn't really exist anymore, and people have changed in their relationship to politicians. I just want to sort of put some slightly why has this happened? I think a lot of it is related to the new political technology which was invented by the New Democrats, the Clinton Democrats in the 1990s, and imported by New Labour. Triangulation, the idea that you made political parties apparently identical. I mean, it's very rational not to vote if New Labour and the Conservatives are the same thing as New Labour. This idea of the art of politics, thought Tony Blair, thought Bill Clinton, was to colonise your opponent's territory and become like them. And if once you've done that, it becomes very off-putting for voters. What is worse, of course, was the deceit which went with it. I just finished reading David Goodhart's astonishing book, actually, about immigration, in which he points out that between 1997 and 2010, there were 4 million immigrants, twice as many as in the previous 50 years. And yet what was interesting was that the New Labour was denying all along that it was doing this. It was a private policy which it kept from the voters. In fact, as we remember, David Blunkett, the Home Secretary, would denounce immigrants. You know, he would say that we've got to stop these immigrants, these scroungers. I think he used words like scroungers even. And so you have a very... yet Peter Mandelson is saying we were setting up search parties for these immigrants. And so you have a very funny thing, the political class doing one thing, i.e. has a very conscious policy to have as many immigrants as possible, and yet denouncing immigrants at the same time, well, stopping immigration at the same time because of a naked elect. And this sends out an extraordinary message about political inauthenticity, which is the lasting, enduring legacy of New Labour, and indeed, insofar as the current Prime Minister is, as he likes to say from time to time, the heir to Blair, we've still got it with us. I think that, so it's not at all surprising, therefore, that voters react in an entirely rational way. Europe is another case in point, where basically there was no discussion out of Europe. It was banned from the BBC. There was, people who wanted to get out of Europe were treated as mad people, or even were mildly Eurosceptic, as lunatics. So basically, voters were told, get lost. If you're out of Europe, you're worried about immigration, you don't really belong here. You don't have a valid political view. So large numbers of voters were told by the political class that they didn't count, they were mad, bigots, racist, and I think that that strong message sent out through the BBC normally, but also through the politically correct newspapers, really told people to get lost out of the political system. There's no room in politics for you, because the things you care about, we don't. In fact, the things you care about show that you're not really fit to be a citizen at all. I think those are the three major points which lie in the background. No discussion about UKIP in your audit of political engagement. It's a bit like Hamlet without the prince, isn't it, really? I mean, it's, they are, that is the reaction. That is what happens if you say to voters, get lost. You know, they will find somewhere else to go. UKIP sort of emerged completely outside all existing political structures. Funnily enough, I still find, I still feel remarkably optimistic. I do think there is something wonderful about British democracy. It is just that the modernisation packages of the main political parties of the last 30 years, these clever strategists who regarded politics as something which belongs to them and not the voters, have done untold damage to British democracy. They've actually carved the heart out of it. And we're living with the consequences. Unfortunately, they're still in power in all three main political parties. Thanks.
To all of you on the floor for question and answers. We've got 2 microphones, I think. Anybody who's sat at the front or around Horseshoe, you've got a microphone in front of you, so you don't need it. Right, show of hands. Who'd like to ask a question, make a comment, think about the findings? Okay, we've got 2 down here. Yep, gentleman on the right.
The position of registering voters is going to be the individual who they register. I should imagine there will be fewer people being registered under that system than under the present system. But of course, if anybody doesn't register, they can be taken to court by the local authority, and I think they're fined up to about £20 or £30 for not registering. I don't know a single council who's ever taken a member of the electorate who's not registered, you know, to get them on the register. But in fact, isn't it going to be a worse situation when every single person has to register themselves?
I'll take the next question before we...
Okay. Well, it's a feast as always, but I'm really alarmed how little emphasis Matt, Corris or Peter Oborne have given to the element of social class and income in this. I mean, I think, Matt, you said, you know, there's a small difference. There's a massive difference in voting, the propensity and vote between, as it were, the top class and the bottom class. It's a bigger difference than any other way of dividing people, sex or ethnicity or whatever. And taking up Peter's very interesting contribution, it's a curious thing, isn't it, that you make the very valid point that one of the reasons people don't vote is there's no point because it's not really different. But the one group of people for whom it is hugely different are the very poor people who, or relatively poor people, who part of whose income, usually only a part, but a part of whose income is benefit dependent. There really is a difference in the parties, and yet they're the people least likely by a huge margin to vote. Sorry. I could go on and on, but I'll shut up.
Okay. So electoral registration and social class. Matt, do you want to comment on the social class element of the audit first?
Sure, absolutely. I entirely agree with you. Partly it wasn't mentioned in the presentation due to lack of time and me saying this pretty much every year that I'm involved in this presentation. If you look at any of the possible ways of cutting up the population as a whole, the most significant differentiating factor in terms of all of the measures of political engagement is indeed social class. The people who are best off are much more interested in politics, feel much more knowledgeable, more likely to get the quiz questions right, more likely to vote. Absolutely agree with you on that one. There's a section towards the end of the report that goes through some of these numbers by different cuts of gender, age, social class, ethnicity and so on, which I recommend to everybody, obviously, to read afterwards. But yes, I totally agree with you. That is, the audit has consistently proved over the last 10 years that that is the biggest one factor that you can look at in terms of affecting political engagement.
Peter, have you got any comments on either of those?
I don't really know enough about the registration point. The social class point, I agree, is unbelievably interesting and relevant, because I have a sense that there may be specific reasons why the very poorest on benefits don't. There may be, I don't know, I'm sorry, I'm not trying. But what you can see is that politics for the last, the effective policies for the last 15 years has to be to enrich, make the rich richer and the very poor a bit richer, and squeeze the left, the rest. And I'd love to see how the sort of lower middle class, I don't know how you classify them, have reacted, because they've clearly been excluded by the lower middle class. I think have been excluded from the political process for all kinds of interesting reasons. The other problem, of course, is the effect of the boundaries, where you have the modernized. Well, Natascha was out of the room while I was looking at the effect of the modernization, the modernizers, the experts on politics, but the experts who've decided just to look at swing voters in marginal constituencies have excluded great tranches of Britain from the political process. I mean, and that is something which has to be, well, one hopes will be remedied, but I don't know how at the moment.
Coming back on, the voter registration, I don't know, admittedly, whether there are fines if you haven't registered, but I certainly I haven't heard of anyone ever being fined for it. Comparatively, you've got Australia, where there's compulsory voting, and you can be fined, theoretically, for not turning out to vote. And again, there, nobody gets fined for not turning out, and I think turnout's only 85 to 90%, so a good chunk of people don't vote in Australia and aren't fined for it. In terms of whether the change in the way people are registered affecting the number of people on the electoral register, yes, it absolutely will affect the number of people on the register. There is a bit of a party political argument about what is the right way to register people to vote, which I will leave to the politicians, but there is certainly a risk that getting people to register on their own, you are more likely, one suspects, to lose out on people who are more transient, certainly. So students being registered to vote, I suspect registration amongst those younger groups will go down. Potential risks among poorer, less engaged people who may not see the value because they don't see the value in voting. What's the value of registering to vote? But I will leave that to Natascha, perhaps.
I just want to say a really brief word about the bedroom tax, about the, your point that you're making. Well, sorry, I'm Labour, so we call it bedroom tax. If I was Tory, I'd call it something else. Whatever you want to call it thing, that actually this is, if it affects you, and I have a constituency where lots of people are affected by this, that they don't feel that this is either a Tory Liberal coalition government doing it or whoever. It is something that is being done to them by government, and whether it's local government or national government doesn't really matter. And so, we nationally, I think, we kind of campaign on these issues when those people who it most affects, they just feel quite sort of it's another thing that's kind of being laid on them. They don't see it politically at all. They just see it in terms of how it hits them in the pocket. And on the point that Peter made about the sort of the professionals and targeting voters, and we've got kind of mosaic and, you know, all these different ways of finding voters, I think actually what I've noticed, certainly since the last general election, is that when you ask people, you know, you talk to people on the doorstep and you ask them how they might vote at the general election, you've had a whole conversation with them and they're kind of quite engaged with you, and then you say, oh, by the way, how are you going to vote? And they go, oh, that's what you were after. And you know, and I've seen canvassers walk up the driveway where somebody hasn't quite shut the door, and they go D or Z, and then people just become their voting intentions. And I think if that's how we treat people, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what political party or what level of politics you're at. If that's kind of our attitude to people, when all we're interested in is their voting intention, then actually it's not really surprising when they start kind of saying to us, well, you know, I'm more than that, and want proper engagement from us.
Okay. One seat here and one over that side, and I'll come to John.
Alan Howard. I think Matt told us that people wanted their MPs to be more accountable between elections. In fact, they are. Yeah. I mean, if you think back to the days when there was 80% turnout at general elections, there was also a world in which not a small number of MPs visited their constituency about once a year. MPs work incredibly hard now. They're very busy bees. They're all over their constituencies all the time, making themselves far more effectively accountable than they once were. So I wonder whether what the relevant differences are between sort of the social and the cultural situation 50, 60 years ago and now. Obviously huge changes, but among them, 50, 60 years ago we were a society that was polarised by class, much more clearly, accepting what you said about inequality, which does matter very much. Nonetheless, I think that far more people would identify themselves now as being middle class, and perhaps indeed as squeezed middle, and that's a relevant difference. And we were polarised by ideology. There was a thing called socialism in those days. You could be socialist or conservative, and people could identify themselves both in terms of class and in terms of where their ideological preferences were, in far more clear-cut terms in those days than they do now.
I found the statistic 48% of the people who'd been canvassed on the subject of what they wanted was more transparency in politics. And that, to me, sounds like a population that regards all politicians with a considerable degree of cynicism and mistrust. And that's a pretty alarming statistic. And also the point which Peter Oborne has made concerning the way in which the constituencies have been juggled around for the preference of the particular party and to ensure its ongoing position, to say nothing of the parachuting in of party-chosen candidates, which knock out any local knowledge of a local MP or local potential MP for every party, and you see it all over the country, and it's being done. But the point that I found particularly interesting in the last few months, and would certainly like Dr. Fox to address, is why no one made the comment when there was an all-party agreement for a legislation-light response to Leveson on the basis that it would be through the process of a royal charter for the creation of a a regime of a regulation of the press, which, because of that route, would automatically circumvent any parliamentary ability to challenge any subsequent alterations when it was decided to move on to bloggers and individuals, because we're going away from hard press, paper press. We are going into a digital age. And to have cynically presented to the public, and apparently some remarkably ill-informed members of Parliament, despite the number of lawyers and despite the legal access that all three party leaders must have. It's inconceivable to me that they did not know about and had thoroughly considered the implication of a report that was published in January 2009, is still available on the website of the charity Justice, and was a 45-page report by a well-regarded QC, Patrick O'Connor, and which I imagine Dr. Fox is fully familiar with. And given that the two co-presidents of the Hansard Society are the Speaker of the House of Lords and the Speaker of the House of Commons, how come no one and none of the press said a word? And I'm just a member of the public.
Okay, well, I'll come back to that. Oh, yes, sorry, Gerald, I think.
I'd just like to pick up on first of all on Chloe Smith's point. I thought, with great respect to her, I thought she was rather complacent. I'm really worried about individual electoral registration. In 1991, I can remember a case I did as a lawyer where we discovered there were 5 to 6 million people unregistered in this country. The Electoral Commission last year, when the individual electoral registration was brought in, have estimated there will be about 11 million people who will not be on this electoral register. So unless the government is going to commit serious resources to having a proper canvass to ensure that there's nobody missing off that register, which I doubt will happen, we are really in for a really big democratic deficit that has been brought about by us to a certain extent by this bit of legislation. The thing I really want to address, which has not actually been dealt with in the audit of engagement, which is the position of trust in the public having in our political masters, both in the MPs and to a lesser extent in the Lords. Now, I've been privileged, or sort of, perhaps cursed, perhaps, to be involved in a number of the cases that have been involved in recent years that have actually given rise to this lack of trust. Just cast your mind back. We had Cash for Questions, which was the times of the Hamiltons, at the tail end of the major years. And then we moved rather smoothly on to Cash for Honours. And when we finished with Cash for Honours, we then moved into the scandal about political donations. And then we moved even more smoothly on to the whole issue of postal voting and the problems that that was causing in some of our communities. And then we hadn't finished with postal voting, we then moved on to parliamentary expenses. Not finished with parliamentary expenses, we had phone hacking. And then, as the lady said, we've touched on to Leveson, and we've now got an almighty scrap going on in the Commons and in the Lords about various charters. And the problem is that the perception of the public is, can we trust our political masters? And the answer is, they've eroded this trust. And there's a really serious issue here, as we've touched upon, and Matt certainly touched upon, perhaps, and the way that we can try and recover this. And it's something of great concern to me. And if I was a voter, and I wasn't really pissed, I was a bit pissed off, why would I bother to find the individual electoral registration? You know, what's the encouragement for that? We have to think of a way of restoring this, and it's not easy. Thank you.
Okay. Peter, do you want to comment first?
Yeah, I was mainly just to agree, I think, with what was... I mean, I think Alan Howard's paradox is incredibly interesting, that you have a fact that the MPs never worked harder, in my view, completely unnecessarily, doing work which ought to be done by local councillors and doctors and people like that, and make a great noise about it, and seem to, and the public still think they're unaccountable. I don't know why that is. I cannot understand. I think that's it is to do, as Alan was suggesting, with changing notions of class and deference, which we haven't really got to the bottom of. And I think that it's greatly encouraged by MPs, because you should just tell the vote that, you know, people who come to your, you know, you get lost really if they ask, you know, you go to the local council about your drainage or whatever it may be, and you're building a rod for your own back, and then you want money for it, you want expenses for it too. You need to be much clearer about this issue, about what MPs are accountable for. I don't think voters give a damn about more transparency in politics. I think that's just a slogan.
I'm all for parachuting in able people. You don't want, I mean, there's room for a few local people in politics, but for goodness sake, do we really want every sort of Wurzel Gummidge representing every single constituency in the country? We want a few Wurzel Gummidges, but not too many. And then and of course, trust is this. Trust is a very good thing, but yeah, as you rightly say, the politicians really have done your best to lose it.
Are there any other MPs in the room?
Look at you, Natascha. You're
I'm at Wurzel Gummidge.
Absolutely not meant to be taken personally.
Oh dear, I was just thought now. I think what Alan says is really important, and Peter as well. It's absolutely true. We have absolutely done this for ourselves, and the reason is because we encourage people to come to our surgeries and to meet us, and for us to be allowed to do things for them, because they then feel grateful to us, and we hope that then when it comes time to vote, that they'll think of us and vote for us in gratitude for what we've done. But actually what that's done is it's made the relationship between the elector and the MP very sort of, the MPs become very passive, and it's become really sort of, what is it that you want me to do for you? And it's like focus groups and polling. What do you want me to do for you? And how do you want me to do it? So then I go away and do it, and I come back and I go, right, I've done it. Now, will you vote for me? And it's kind of that, it's all come being sort of turned into a sort of quite needy relationship. And rather than actually kind of, you know, on really complicated issues like immigration and well, you know, on things like the democratic deficit, and, you know, actually saying, we disagree on this. The reason why I think this is because X, and I'm going to try and persuade you why I think this and why this is a good thing. And actually kind of, you know, being prepared to disagree with, well, just disagree with people and have a proper conversation with them, rather than trying to second guess what it is that they're wanting you to say. And I think if we were a little bit more sort of assertive about our beliefs, and I also agree about the sort of the, you know, Labour used to be the party of socialism, and the Tories used to be the party of capitalism, and then the Liberal Democrats came along and they started doing sort of, you know, sort of pothole campaigning, and that all kind of fell by the wayside. But actually, you don't need to have those kind of great big sort of ideological structures in order to have voters identify with one or the other. But you can have definite opinions and allow people to disagree with you. And just because they disagree with you doesn't make, you know, you right or them wrong, or the other way around. And I just think we've become quite timid. And I think everything that's happened afterwards with the expenses scandal and, you know, the lack of trust and everything else, you know, that story about the woman coming in and saying, well, it's very nice to see an MP doing a bit of work for a change, you know, that it kind of it sort of takes it out of you, and you kind of feel again sort of like, oh no, and it makes you feel, you know, weaker and weaker. And I think we need to sort of you know, just assert ourselves a bit and have something that people can disagree with us on.
Don't you agree that the real problem there is that, with all sincerity, you can say to your constituents, look, I think that as your MP, having heard the strength of your feelings about this high-speed line, and to give them all the comfort and all the sincerity that you do, you've either got to resign, or if you're whipped to vote for it, you have to follow the whip. Or alternatively, trash your political career.
God, you're so extreme.
Whoa, extreme. Well, it's just I'm passionate about politics, and I think what you don't also understand is that many of the young teenagers are extremely passionate and extremely frustrated.
No, and I understand exactly what you're saying. It's just that it's perfectly possible to disagree, and you can vote against your party line if it's something that really is a very important matter for your constituency, and not have to stand down as an MP. I think, you know, I think that's perfectly.
I've read a lot of votes.
I'm just going to have to
I've just rebelled.
Natascha has just rebelled. She's not planning on resigning. Okay, Matt, very quickly on any of that.
I was just going to say the point you said about people wanting transparency in politics, sort of greater transparency, and the cynicism of that. If you dig through the numbers, you see that the people who are more engaged, who feel more knowledgeable about politics, are less likely to say that that's a reform that would make a real difference to them. They don't see that as the answer. It is the people who are less engaged who say, yes, transparency is what we need. So,
yeah, well, I haven't had a chance of reading the report.
Yeah.
Just on the Leveson very quickly, I would advise everybody, have a look at Audit 9, Part 2, that we published last year. We did give evidence on that to Leveson. One of my difficulties with Leveson is he didn't touch on it at all.
Very wise.
I think one of the issues with Leveson I have with it is that it doesn't really touch on the impact of and the relationship between the press and politics, and the impact on the political process. Right, three more hands up. Okay, we've got a gentleman at the back, got a gentleman here, and a gentleman there. Yeah.
Thanks very much. I just wanted to start by saying thank you to Hansard and all the panellists for very interesting insights. My question, though, was around some confusion that Matt had in the fact that the voting numbers are down, but the number of people appearing to want to be engaged is up. And for me, that's not confusing at all. That's a very strong message. And to kind of coin Peter's expression, it shows a bit of a system in collapse, really. Maybe not in collapse, but certainly there's some big issues there. So really my question, and Natascha's not there anymore, but I'll direct it maybe more towards Peter, is if the newspapers are having to adopt new formats to deal with their issues, maybe it's time Parliament did the same.
Thank you. One here, one there.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think one of the most interesting points that was made about the people saying that they would have liked to have learned things about how Parliament works and who does what. I mean, certainly that's my experience. I teach undergraduate law students who are perhaps atypical, that you'd expect them to know more about this, but this is something that comes up a lot, that they come to university wishing they knew more about how Parliament works and showing a very low level of knowledge. I mean, partly that is school, and I think we've got to address that, but I think also people do learn from the press. I would disagree with Mr. Oborne. I think the BBC actually does a better job than some of the press on educating people. But one thing I find, and some of this is actually second-year undergraduates, unable to tell the difference between the European Union and the European Convention on Human Rights, because they've read on the papers that the European Court has decided. I think also the press can reinforce this idea that it's one way or the other way, and don't stress the deliberative process which has been, which is so important. We're saying that you'll read in the newspapers all politicians are the same, and yet we're not actually discussing some of those subtleties of difference and the need for that deliberative process.
My name is Hans Ulrich. I like particularly the contribution about the need to create a system in which people can trust. I think we need to stop just thinking about what's wrong. We have to start thinking more about how to make things better and to develop models that can actually contribute to establishing more trust and maybe more professionalism in what's happening in politics. I don't want to make marketing in my own matters, but I publish a blog under optimizingdemocracy.org. There is a model of how I could imagine to go forward. Maybe you want to take a look at that model. If you don't agree, develop a better one. But we need to move forward.
Thank you. Peter.
Yeah.
By the way, occasionally I've been looking at my emails. It's not because I'm in some sort of... my column is going out tomorrow morning at the Daily Telegraph, and I'm hopeful that they're going to send it to me so I can see it before it reaches the streets, which they haven't done. That's all it is. There's nothing to do with it. It's rather rude, it must have seemed. Can I just answer that question, which is really interesting, and I've been brooding on it, about what is happening to newspapers. Is there an analogy with politicians and the way that newspapers are going to new formats? Should therefore politicians do that? And I guess the answer probably ultimately is yes, but what we've seen so far, I think, paradoxically, from the new formats, from the new digital, the online, there's Twitter, etc., seems to me to be very anti-democratic, oddly, so far. It prioritises, it enfranchises an elite, a very small group of almost entirely young men, as far as I can tell, who are computer literate and blog and tweet at each other endlessly and have an extraordinarily powerful effect on the political process. Conservative Home is the most classic case in point. Very interesting right-wing pressure group on the Conservative Party, clearly had a lot of effect on the Tory policy and on the government, and yet it's a creation really of young men in their 20s and 30s, and probably I should think about a core of maybe 10 or 15 of them and a wider 20,000 of them. It completely excludes 99.99% of the voting public, and so far, and the same with all this Twitter chatter you get around the place, which has a lot of impact, I think. Again, it reflects a tiny metropolitan class of, again, almost invariably male political activists, rather totally unhealthy, disastrous, I think, actually, for the political process. And so they haven't found a solution yet to the... by the way, I don't agree with you about the press. It's got to be passionate. It's got to present stuff from a passionate, committed way. You know, all the other sort of, you're right, on the one hand, on the other hand, you know, forget it. Readers won't get beyond paragraph 2, and nor should it, nor would a politician who presented it. On the one hand, on the other hand, the Patrick Cormack School of Political Discourse. I mean, it's hopeless. I mean, you know, thank God he's gone to the House of Lords. I mean, the trust point. I mean, if you look at the last election, the issue was all the parties after the election were going to try and slash spending. But they spent their entire election programme promising to spend. I mean, it's extraordinary. In the 2005 election, they never discussed, it's a great rule of politics the last 15 years, that the great issues of the day are never discussed in general elections. They're secret, and governments use being in government to change language. It's a very, you understand, it's a very big thought, this, actually. General elections, parties lie and cheat to win them. They then use being in power in order to create the bully pulpit given them by government to do what they wanted to do secretly but weren't saying so in the general election. And it's a very interesting thing which happens. That's all. You always go out of the room when I'm speaking, Natascha.
It's the whip that put on a vote. We've got lying, bullying and cheating and then walk back in.
Gentleman at the back, about sort of people's greater desire for involvement, but few of them saying they're certain to vote. Yes, one would like to think this is, the opening is for other forms of people getting engaged. The problem is that none of the other activities, we offered people a list of things you might want to do, attend a political meeting, take part in a consultation, any of those things. None of those came anywhere near voting in an election or contacting your local councillor or MP. So there isn't a very clear sense of, here is the mechanism by which I want to be involved. That doesn't mean there aren't opportunities to try and find new ways of getting people involved that might lead them to more formal forms of political engagement and hopefully more likely to vote. But there doesn't seem to be an easy answer, certainly in the public's awareness of, this is how I would like to get involved, I'm just being denied the opportunity. On the point about trust, we produced, I think, quite a good briefing paper a couple of years ago about trust in politics, and one of the main conclusions was politicians should stop going around saying we need to rebuild trust in politics. You do not rebuild trust in politics. Trust is an amorphous thing. You should get on and do the best possible job you can. And if people see you doing a good job, if they approve of what you do, they will trust you. They will not trust you if you go around talking about, please trust me. We should also not pretend that politicians have ever been the most loved or trusted people. There is no golden age of people loving politicians or trusting them, so let's not go too overboard on that.
Okay, 3 more. Gentlemen, no, you've already asked one. Is there anybody else? There's John, gentleman there, and gentleman at the back on the windowsill. John. If we can try and keep them a bit snappy, we might get one
Chairman,
more
I
round.
just have to come back. I wholly agree with Peter Oborne, but I would remind him what Jefferson said when he said, do I take the judgment of the professor or the ploughman? He said, I will always take the ploughman because he will give me his judgment from the gut, and the professor will say on the one hand or the other hand. So your Wurzel Gummidge is what the professor would, what Jefferson would have taken. The thing that has really joined things together is the truth of the matter. For the last 25 years, all our political parties have concentrated on 1% of the electorate, being that 10% in the marginal constituencies, and within those marginal constituencies, the 10% floating voters. And their focus groups have been wholly concerned with the 1%. The rest of us could go hanged. That's the truth. The problem that they've now got is that UKIP's come on the scene, and suddenly every seat is a marginal seat. And they don't know what to do about it because they ignored all their membership for many, many years. When I joined the Conservative Party, 2.5 million members, 100,000 and falling, and they can no longer mount a national campaign on the ground. And that, the supreme irony is that the political parties started as registration societies, getting voters onto the register to ensure that their supporters could vote. And they have destroyed this whole system. And the reason is because our main parties are oligarchies. They're not democratic organisations at all. And it is about time the Electoral Commission got off its butt and did something about it and made it certain that a political party has to be ultimately controlled by its membership. Then we'll get participation, then we'll get a movement, and if the main parties don't do it, they'll just go out of existence.
Great, thanks, John. Can you pass the microphone to the gentleman? No.
Very good.
Okay.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask, what does it mean for a democracy if only 12% of young people are certain to vote if there's an election, and who do you think is probably responsible for doing something about that?
Okay. Yeah, and gentleman right at the back window.
Kevin Williams, Stinger Report. With respect, I think we may be looking in the wrong direction. We're talking about a situation aptly standing in the Thatcher room where the ability to vote was made something unward, something that people tried to avoid because they wanted to avoid the poll tax. We now have a large selection of our populace who avoid voting. It has nothing to do with the facts of the corruptness of the people that represent them or the individuals that try and select their vote. We are now at a situation where there is a black economy of people who do not have the vote, and we are missing that point.
Okay, thank you. Natascha.
Oh, UKIP. I mean, I've got, obviously, it's a Labour constituency, but certainly at the last county elections, where we looked, I mean, the UKIP vote took most away from the Tories, but actually there was plenty of, there were plenty of areas which should have been absolutely solid Labour who haven't voted for a long time, where there was a very high turnout for UKIP. And I know that there's been so much commentary on it, and I'm loath to give my own opinion on it because you've heard a million of them, but I think actually UKIP could have quite a positive effect on politics, in that it is a sort of it's a much more normal narrative, and you know, whatever you want to say about Nigel Farage, you know, he kind of and what he wears and how he presents himself, he does talk like most people talk. And what he says, people sort of think, well, yeah, that makes perfect sense. He doesn't do the on the one hand, on the other hand. It's always terribly complicated and don't worry your pretty little head about it. He kind of, and it may be a bit sort of fruity and blue and all the rest of it, but it does engage with people. And I think actually I think everyone at the moment is kind of a bit headless chickeny about it and kind of go, oh, what do we do? What do we do? Do we offend them? Are we nice to them? And then everyone's kind of falling over themselves, calling them it's a mainstream political party. And but I think that'll all settle down, and actually it might have a very positive effect on everything that it is that we do. I think the danger is that we then go the other way and we start getting overly populist, and that is a danger, I think, because then everything gets reduced to just oversimplified, and I don't think the world is like that. I don't think that the political parties are undemocratic. I think they are. I think they are democratic. I just think that perhaps the organisations, the memberships of those organisations need to kind of assert themselves a bit more. I don't think it's necessarily the processes, because the processes of political parties and of trade unions, and they're quite heavily overseen to make sure that they are, that they are democratic. I just think, it's also about people not walking away from things and actually kind of, taking control of things themselves, and that's the membership. So, I always get very annoyed when Labour Party members leave the party because, the party has moved away from them. Well, take it back, and I think that we should be a bit more like that. Young people and voting and who's responsible. I don't know. Lots of people think that MPs should be responsible for it. I have 72,000 constituents, and that's everybody over 18. I have 54 schools. I try and go to as many of them as possible, but to kind of actually... I don't think Twitter is the answer. I don't think that kind of will overnight engage everybody. And I don't think also that, trying to sort of find things that interest young people or trying to sort of be younger, and, I don't think that helps either. I still think with young people, they're just younger. They're still people, and they have issues that interest them. And it's about finding those interests, those issues that interest them. What was the... Oh, the last bit was about registration. It goes back to what Gerald said. It's enormously important. If you look at the demographic that isn't registered, I do find it quite alarming, that's something that we're really starting to slack on. The demographics being poorer and ethnic minorities, and especially in the sort of the big cities where people just disappear, and that is undemocratic.
Two quick points, I guess, given we're running out of time. On UKIP, and just picking up Peter's remark earlier as well, this survey was done just at the end of last year, so one of the weeks in December. There weren't enough people, I think, in the survey sample to really pick out UKIP voters as different to other people when factoring in all of the questions on political engagement. Who knows, though, this time next year, when we've done the survey this coming December, whether there will be a big enough chunk of UKIP supporters that we can start looking at the differences in their political engagement. So prep for this time next year, we might be able to talk about that. In terms of registering to vote, just the numbers. We asked in the audit survey, are you registered to vote? 88% of people said they were registered to vote. It was quite interesting to look. There's a survey done for the Electoral Commission in the same week as was done for the audit, and it was done on the telephone rather than face-to-face that the audit was done on. 95% of people answering a telephone survey said they were registered to vote. I think it's an interesting reflection on polling methodologies. Maybe face-to-face you're more likely to pick up people who aren't registered to vote, but that's roughly the numbers we think that are registered at the moment. Who knows what it will be when registration system changes.
Peter.
Yeah, very briefly, I took John Strafford's excellent piece of oratory to be a statement rather than a question. And on the issue of the poll tax, I think if people, whether they're billionaires who go and live in Monaco and avoid tax that way, or people who dodge paying that tax, don't register to vote because they don't want to pay tax, at local communities, I don't think they deserve to have a vote. I'm not very concerned about people who don't want to pay tax not getting to vote. I think what we're talking about here is being a citizen, and to be a citizen is what is at the heart of all of this in many ways. I mean, this terrifying figure of 12% of young people. I mean, I mustn't get too excited about it because young people sort of evolve, but there is something about, these endless earnest discussions about young people can get rather embarrassing and trite. But what has gone wrong here, and I think it's not just with politics, it's with society, isn't it? It's too consumerist, it's too much about the individual, it's too much the sense of being together, being part of communities and the nation even, is being lost. And that's, of course, a subject which goes much deeper than politics, although politics is a manifestation of that problem.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, we've now sort of running out of time, so the House authorities will kick us out of the room shortly in a few minutes. So I'm going to have to draw things to a close. Can I thank everyone for participating? A big thank you to Natascha for doing the equivalent of the Westminster Sprint 3 times. Back and forth, back and forth. Big thank you to Peter for taking part tonight when his column is due. Up against deadlines. My colleagues are going to have boxes of books at both exits. You can pick one up on your way out. A few thank yous to my colleagues at Society who play such a big part in making tonight happen and producing the report. Big thank you to our colleagues at TNS BMRB who do the survey for us each year and are absolutely essential to the audit process. And a big particular thank you to the House of Commons and the Cabinet Office who continue to support the audit project financially year to year, and without them we would not be able to do this work, and I think it's some credit to them that they continue to do so, even though in many respects it's quite critical of them. So big thank you to them. You will have got on your seats some information about our next event coming up, about young people, about the Scottish vote, 16-year-olds next month. Information about our journal, Parliamentary Affairs, where you can find more exciting information and up-to-date research done by some of our academic colleagues across the country. So on that note, can I wish all of you a very pleasant evening, safe journey home, and hope to see you at one of our events in the future. Thank you very much.